Hey everyone, I'm Jesse. I'm here with my brother Dan, and today we're going to review David Fincher's new Netflix movie, The Killer, starring Michael Fassbender, which is adapted from a French graphic novel of the same name. Michael Fassbender plays an unnamed hitman who is based in Paris, waiting for his target, and then things go horribly wrong when he bungles the operation despite his meticulous preparation. And then he has to face the violent fallout. I think David Fincher in this movie is very much intentionally demystifying the contract killer and that kind of glamour and mystique and mystery surrounding the hitman that we often get in Hollywood movies. Fassbender's hitman is not glamorized in any way. He's treated as this emotionless robot who even describes himself as just a part, just a cog in a machine. When he's out in public, he just tries to blend in. He often just wears ordinary clothes like a ball cap and a hoodie. There's a scene of him like going to McDonald's, eating McMuffins. He's never named. He remains anonymous. There's this impersonal distance between him and us, the audience, continually.
It was a strange viewing experience because I felt alienated and completely detached from what I was watching.
Yeah.
And I was also engaged enough to want to keep watching, wanting to know what was going to happen. I thought that Fassbender's uh, narrative voiceover, that kind of neo-noir gesture was effective. And I was just intellectually stimulated, as I often am with David Fincher's films. I was intellectually stimulated enough to just want to keep watching and see how things turn out, in spite of the fact that he does everything he can to cut us off from any kind of emotional or affective involvement in the character or what's going on.
Sometimes with these kinds of movies about professional killers, they often have the main hitman character undergo like a moral struggle or some kind of conflict that's going to test the killer morally, which is not here at all. By the end of the movie, he is the same person. And so there's like this eviscerating like cynicism embedded in the whole experience of watching it that is very alienating, as you say, but yet kind of fascinating as well.
Yeah, I think there's two basic problems here. The two problems are, of course, how is he going to find his way out of the problem of the initial decision he makes to go on a quest of what appears to be vengeance, or at least a quest to render himself and his girlfriend secure. There's that problem. How's he going to accomplish or find his way out of that? And then there's the other, to me, more central problem of whether or not the assassin's ethos he's developed it will maintain him through that quest, and whether or not he will remain faithful to it. And I think that seems to be the primary focus point of the drama, such as there is any drama in the film, is what is the relationship between this character and the personal ethos, the philosophy of principles that he's developed. So it's a very theoretical film in a self-conscious way. It's because this character is driven by a theory of how to succeed in the world, which is to say he's driven by his personal ideology.
Yeah.
And how that unfolds is again the primary interest.
In the opening monologue, particularly, that really sets the stage for who he is. And he quotes from everything from Popeye to like Aleister Crowley. Do what thou wilt should be the whole of the law. Aleister Crowley, who was this English occultist that's referenced, but in Crowley's magical views, in order to achieve one's ultimate purpose and mission, manifesting one's will, the occultist had to like subvert, socially instilled inhibitions. Sometimes that would mean engaging in unethical behavior, to manifest one's will and ultimate will. And so that Crowley reference was there to kind of align Crowley's thinking with the professional contract killer and the type of person who would do that kind of work.
Yeah, and I think the idea of the will too. So it's this idea of a kind of personal authenticity and self-sufficiency that becomes the mark of a true subject. It's also in the film, of course, fabricated from postmodern elements. his references come from Crowley. His references come from, at one point he paraphrases Proverbs, so there's a biblical reference there. Um, and then his references also come from pop culture. So at the same time as it's this parable of an existential subject trying to remain true to this personal philosophy, you can see on all his passports and his other identifying documents, he's using the names of vintage TV characters, and nobody recognizes this or marks it. We can get to that later, but I think that the idea of the kind of 21st century postmodern consumer empire that this world is worth talking about when we get to that point.
It's interesting to see Fincher take on a contract killer who specifically is doing this not out of joy, not out of sadism, because he enjoys killing, who distreats killing as a business.
Yeah, but I think that the idea of duality in this film is really interesting because, like I said earlier, where there's two basic problems. There's the literal material problem of actually doing the work that he set out for himself, but then there's the spiritual, theoretical and intellectual problem of remaining true to this ethos. The film is really, I think, very much an examination of this character's personal and ethical failure. But I think the interesting thing about it is that he's a failed character, not because he kills people, innocent or guilty. It doesn't matter. That's not the rubric that we're examining his work through. We're examining it through his moral rubric, his ethical rubric. And the failure is not that he's murdering and killing. The failure is that or should I say, is maybe the question of his failure is whether he's been able to hold true to the principles he set out for himself. And at least by his own measure, by the end of the film, he seems to have acknowledged that he has failed, even though he's accomplished this mission, and is home safe with his girlfriend in the Dominican Republic, early retirement. He no longer identifies himself as one of the few. He thinks, now I'm just one of the many. At the beginning, he says, I want to be one of the few. The world is the few dominating and controlling the many. I'd rather be one of the few. By the end, he identifies himself as that mass of people who are being dominated and controlled. So by his own measure, he's failed. So the film is asking us to contemplate failure, moral failure, from the skewed, weird perspective of this affectless assassin.
Yeah.
One of the things that's really alienating about the film, but it's also intellectually stimulating because it asks us to think about the contingencies and the complexities of actually what counts as good and bad, high or low, good or evil in our own moral rubrics, and how contingent and strange and skewed those often become, regardless of how secure we think the framework is.
I think I agree with that point that by the end of the film there's a shift, and yeah, he has failed in his mind in some way. I am, however, not quite sure that it's a moral failure because I feel like his character never underwent a moral struggle. He has no inhibitions about killing from the very beginning. That's just not an issue for him. And the film, at least for me, as a viewer, never really challenged that or tested that in any scene. It was just a logistical thing for him throughout it of how do I get to A to B. But there's some irony there because of his like pride in his craftsmanship and his precision and his planning. Yet in every scenario throughout the film, nothing ever goes according to his plan.
I think what's interesting is why I call it a moral failure is that it's a moral failure from his perspective. And the film doesn't ever intrude upon that. It doesn't offer an alternative.
Oh, I see.
So I think it's truly existential in that sense because it insists that any kind of moral code we have has to be one that's personal and developed from the standpoint of who we posit ourselves to be within a contingent socio-historical framework, who we are psychologically, morally, our backgrounds. That process is all contingent, and when it is developed, it's private and secretive, and it can't rely on a kind of metaphysical framework.
Yeah.
So the film doesn't offer any alternative. So there's never any question of whether this character is going to undergo any kind of personal transformation on the level of maybe becoming religious or becoming a pacifist or something like that. The drama is elsewhere because the film insists with him that there's no alternative here. You
Yeah.
know, it's either sink or swim with who he is and what he has posited himself to be.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. All right, I see where you're coming from now. Yeah, because he holds him up. He has these principles and that he has to abide by, and that's his moral code. And the irony of that is that giving way to empathy or any kind of emotion would be going against his moral code.
Exactly. So the really distorted weird thing is that when he has moments that we would identify as more human, for instance, with the secretary, where he decides to break her neck and it'll appear as if she's fallen down the stairs and had an accident so that her kids can collect her insurance. That's a moment of utter moral failure. He didn't follow the principle of no empathy because what he should have done in that instance is make her just simply disappear, the way that he knows how. And she says that herself. I know you have a way of making things seem. I can't just disappear though, because then my kids can't collect the insurance. So yes, he kills her, but that's not the moment of moral weakness. The moment of moral weakness is not making her disappear after killing her. And so there's just these moments where, again, the failure is it turns my own moral framework upside down because it's this completely distorted framework that I would identify as sick, and yet the film raises this very interesting question of where, okay, so in the postmodern 21st century world, in a world after as existentialism and after the world wars and all these other things, what do we have but our own personal code of conduct? And if we don't hold true to that, why isn't that the ultimate measure of who we are as subjects?
One of the rituals he has to almost like decondition himself and strip away his emotion and empathy is depressing music. Like the Smiths are continually on his playlist throughout the movie.
Yeah, no, I think the Smiths play a really interesting role in the film, and sometimes I do think it's maybe a little overplayed. But again, I do think it's an effective way of emphasizing the characters, stressing of repetition and deadening and um, desensitization. Um, but I think also the idea that there's this specific cultural reference or this moment in the U.S. And UK '80s, kind of culture of pop punk. Um, so it marks him as a subject of history, right? So that there is this idea that they're part of his process, but there's something else there too. I think the question of enjoyment is really interesting. I mean, does he play the Smiths because he enjoys them? Well, if he plays the Smiths because he likes them, that makes him just like everybody else. It's no longer part of his process, right? It's like this is the music that I dig. So even that little detail um, raises the question of whether or not he can hold true to what increasingly becomes an obviously untenable code of conduct he's set for himself.
One thing I do want to mention that I had a mixed reaction and response to in the movie is the product placement. So we mentioned the scene of him in McDonald's, and I thought that was well done. It was very much a moment in the movie where, okay, stop. Here's a word from our sponsor, McDonald's, but they weave it into its own little segment in the movie where he goes to McDonald's, he gets a McMuffin, taking a bite out of it, and there's just no enjoyment at all. It is just there to like sustain him and give him, protein source. And so I thought with the product placement, that was an example of how it was like well done. And I understand like big movies like this, that comes with the territory. When we look at my notes, I made a list of the products here. McDonald's, there's Starbucks, Kia Cars, Hertz, Airbnb, Amazon, Ace Hardware, Postmates, Haagen-Dazs ice cream. I thought like the product placement was well woven into certain scenes, but then it became very like in your face. where it like halted and stopped the narrative and I just like focused on it.
What I think is interesting about that, though, is that if I were McDonald's, I would almost sue David Fincher because, like, the point seems to be that, like, of course, who's the niche consumer for McDonald's? Desensitized contract killers. So the film is sort of like its product placement is perverse from the standpoint of advertisers, right? Because the overwhelming impression seems to be that these products do nothing to alleviate the deadening alienation this character feels. And that's one of the primary propositions that capitalist consumer culture makes to you.
I see that. I think my mixed reaction was the fact that the movie was very cynically minded and self-aware of that consumer culture and those kinds of placements, but still they were there as products placed to like sell you the brand.
Oh,
So
sure.
I do think I agree with you, though. It made the viewing experience and take on the hitman, the contract killer, interesting when he's like globe trotting because there's a uniformity to everywhere he goes. Like you often in a movie where you go from location to location to location, there's like an exotic quality to it. It's immersing yourself in a different cultural surrounding and trying to acclimate to that. But wherever he goes, it's defined by these big brand names that you see. Like he's in Paris, but just like in Pulp Fiction, the killer's there who are talking about a royale with cheese. He's there in France, going to McDonald's.
Well, and that's how Pulp Fiction is how you actually plug a product, right? Because that makes me hungry for McDonald's.
Yeah.
This film does not make me hungry for McDonald's.
No, it does not. No,
Yeah.
the McMuffin he's eating looks nasty and depressing.
Well, yeah, and like you said, it is just a protein source. What it'll do? It'll fuel you long enough to get the job done, so that you can be a productive member of consumer society.
I think there is a sameness to and monotony to the tone of the movie that's reflected in his surroundings. Wherever he goes, everywhere is the same.
Well, and I think that this is the point about I wanted to like kind of like make eventually about global space in the film is that it makes sense that McDonald's would be so prominently featured because we're living in well into the era of McWorld, right? Where wherever you go, whether it's Europe or the United States or elsewhere, you're surrounded by the major signifiers of our global culture, which are, of course, major corporate brand names and logos and commodities. And that's as stultifying and deflating as anything else that's going on in the film. And it kind of makes perfect sense, then that the iconography would be that, given the story that's being told. I think that the implication is that the Fassbender character is unquestionably a product in some way of this environment, this global culture of empire, consumer empire.
I think the product placement too, and the ordinariness of seeing a character like him actually go buy consumer products that we all buy. It makes him very ordinary like ourselves, and maybe in a perverse way relatable on that level.
Well, what do we all do? We have a job, we have to do it, right? And in a way, that's what we watch. We watch him have some things to do, and that's it. He does those things, and then the film ends. And that's a job of work. That's a 9 to 5 or a 6 to 8 or whatever it is you work. That's the work you do, and this is the work he does.
Except for like one, kind of action set piece in the movie, a lot of what you see is very, excessively monotonous and just very unexceptional.
Yeah, and I think the idea again is that even when we pass into these moments of violence are not exceptional. I mean, the character gives us this idea of a monotonous, inevitable global calculus of death at the very beginning. Like X number of people will die and X number of people will be born every single day, and nothing I do, which is to say nothing that the Fassbender character does, is going to change that numbers game. So again, the idea is, what's the impact? What are the moral complications of the harm done I do? Nil, nothing. What I do doesn't matter. By implication, nothing that anyone does matters.
In that respect, too, he's thinking like a businessman, like a capitalist, just thinking in metrics and numbers.
What can I do to succeed? All right, that's what really is. It's success or failure in a numbers game. One of the ideas being suggested here is that characters like Hannibal Lecter, Michael Fassbender's character, the killer here, they make us uncomfortable because they suggest to us just how similar our ordinary symbolic daily lives are to what we're watching, and also how similar our imaginary psychodynamic ideological existences are, and that there's this equivalence between us and these grotesque figures. But not only that, in some ways, they're also moral paragons. You know, I mean, Hannibal Lecter is a moral paragon judged from the perspective of his own personal philosophy of conduct. It really challenges one of our assumptions about what makes a moral person, and somebody who sticks to their guns, right? Someone who sticks to their code of conduct no matter what. Well, who does that person look like? That person looks like Hannibal Lecter. That person looks like the Joker from The Dark Knight. I mean, one thing I will say, though, about the examples of Hannibal Lecter and the Joker is that Fassbender's character does not fit in with those characters, though, because, again, I think he can't remain true to that code of conduct. And in fact, if I ask myself, where does the failure happen? It happens the minute he goes on this quest. It happens the minute it's revealed that he has a girlfriend. All these things that mark him as this frail human character who still has some kind of minimum level of feeling and emotion, because it's clear that she's not just a sexual partner. There's something more there than just a sexual relationship, especially the way that she talks about not giving up anything up, the way she's loyal to him. The implication is that that's a real relationship.
Yeah.
So the failures already happened the minute he decides to go on this quest, and then we just watch him applying this logic in the wake of that initial formative failure.
Wow, very good point. And that just makes me think of the whole profession of his as a killer, because he wants everything to go according to plan, to be this perfect, well-oiled machine system in place. But the act of killing in itself, and he acknowledges this in the film, creates chaos. And so he's a vehicle as a killer of this cathartic violence that whenever it happens on screen, everything goes to shit.
Well, and this is also a real moral ethical check for the viewer, because I find the moments of violence in this film really energizing, and they're a complete relief from the tedium of the rest of the film. And then
Yeah.
I stop and think, well, wait a second, what does that say about me? That when violence erupts, it's just this moment of breathing release, right? I feel like I can breathe, that there's been some release of tension, that now I'm in this zone of exceptional eventfulness, where this exceptional eventfulness where real things are happening, and it's exhilarating, and there's adrenaline rush there. So it's sort of like Fincher again asking us to intellectually scrutinize the appeal of the action adventure genre, or any genre really.
So what was your overall response?
A minus. The minus is not because of the product placement. It's because of that scene with Tilda Swinton, which I found a little overwritten, where she kind of spells things out for him. The film is very disciplined at other places of being less direct and less clumsy with that messaging. But that's the one scene where I felt like they decided to go in a direction of telling us a little too explicitly, when the film is so meticulous and such an intellectual product anyway. Count on me to actually notice what you're doing in every scene. You don't need to spell it out like that in that one scene that like you did.
Again, for me, that scene was deflated by like the product placement. And
Sure.
she's saying, "Oh, it's
Haagen-Dazs.
my last supper here. I wish I got that Haagen-Dazs." and so that any kind of tension in the scene was kind of deflated, because I kept like being distracted. I mean, I'm nitpicking here, but just in terms of when I was watching it, like I think that scene was there to have a sense of like build up and tension to it. And then again, an instance where the product placement just kind of distracted me. I was kind of smirking, and found it unintentionally funny and humorous. Maybe it was intended to be so, but I'm not sure it was.
I don't think so. I mean, Fincher is not a director who I think utilizes humor intentionally. I can't think of a single one of his films that's had a kind of broad stroke of humor or even a minimal stroke of humor. He's kind of a humorless director, in my opinion.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, I would say so. Usually there's a like a cynical commentary as you get in like Fight Club, that has a dark humor to it, but it's not the kind of humor that is joyous or you laugh at.
Really intellectually stimulating film. I mean, if you want to watch a film that's really gonna, I think, make you think, this is definitely a one to watch.
So I enjoyed the movie, and I appreciated its different take on the contract killer. That, as we said, this character is not glamorized, and it's just demystified. Just strips away that mystique and mystery. All right, so that's our review of David Fincher's The Killer. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and we'll see you next time.